Final Fantasy XIV is a great MMO with tons of content from dungeons to raids to maps to so many other things that I could sit here for the whole video listing them all. But nothing's perfect. Among all the systems and mechanics jam-packed into the game, there are bound to be a few misses. And it's not a secret that one of those misses is the role skill system, first introduced in 4.0 and later hotfixed in 4.4. I'm Ariza, a game developer who has been playing Final Fantasy XIV since Heavensward. I primarily do Savage and Ultimate content, but I try to participate in everything, and over the course of my videos, I hope to do comprehensive analyses on various game mechanics, focusing on Final Fantasy XIV. So now with 5.0 coming around the corner, and another revamp likely to happen, I want to do an in-depth dive on the role skill system and how it might be improved. And as a quick aside, I'm mainly going to be looking at the 5-slot system introduced in 4.0, and briefly touch upon the 4.4 changes near the end of the video. With that out of the way, let's get straight into it. I think it's pretty obvious that one of the main purposes of the role skill system is to give players meaningful choices. As a healer, do I want Cleric Stance or Eye for an Eye? As a caster, will my party benefit more from APOC or Addle? Players should be able to adopt their role skills to fit their team, their playstyle, or the content they are participating in. And in this regard, role skills are somewhat successful, at least more than what browsing Reddit might tell you. Take Provoke for example. It's an essential skill for regaining control of the boss after your healer lets you die to auto attacks, but its usefulness is much more diminished in dungeon runs, where you are more likely to die from mob packs and Ultimatum becomes the more preferable option. A similar example here is that Feint is a strong mitigation tool for melee DPS to take in raids, but since you can only feint a single target on a somewhat long cooldown, it doesn't see much use in dungeons. Role skill choices matter from raid to raid as well. Feint is again an example of good here. While great in fights with physical tank busters or hard-hitting auto attacks, it's not quite as good in fights with mixed damage, and completely useless when all damage is magical. Break has its place in content that's heavily mana intensive, which can be fight dependent, or when doing challenge runs such as solo healing, since it allows you to DPS for free, but it isn't as useful when you don't have to heal as much. Another benefit of role skills is that in some circumstances, players are able to express their playstyle through their role skill choices. For example, some tanks or healers may prefer convalescence for strong periods of healing, but just as many would rather see awareness to prevent spike damage from critical hits. This is a decision that you make within your party, and ultimately comes down to personal preference and playing how you like to play. Additionally, the role skill system has the added benefit of promoting team interaction. Some skills that do this are the ranged DPS role's Refresh skill, and the healer role's Lucid Dreaming skill. To make the most out of their mana, the healers need to work together with the ranged DPS to juggle both the mana refreshing properties of these skills and the equally important enmity cutting effects. Tanks alternating using Reprisal is another example here, although in Duty Finder, chances are your tanks don't even know the skill exists. A final, sometimes overlooked, benefit is that role skills standardize when important skills are learned. A dungeon designer can decide how much damage mob skills do based around the knowledge that the tank does or doesn't have Rampart available to them at that level. If Warrior were to get Rampart at level 20, and Dark Knight got it at level 50, all the dungeons in between would be a nightmare to balance. And while this balance is possible to achieve without the role skill system, the dev team has shown that it's not their top priority through how Scholar was designed in both A Realm Reborn and Heavensward. Remember everything we just talked about for the past few minutes? Well, you can throw it all out because this section nearly invalidates every benefit of the role skill system. By far the biggest issue is that role skills are far too polarizing. There are 0 cases in which you don't want to take Rampart as a tank or Lucid Dreaming as a healer, and there are 0 cases where you would want Crutch, which is a skill that cures dots or slows or something. Skills are very obviously the best or very obviously the worst, and sometimes they bounce between the two. All those interesting skills that I talked about in the previous sections that enable player choice, they're the exception to the rule, and that's the unfortunate reality of the system. So let's take a deeper dive and use healer role skills as an example. 99% of the time, your typical healer role skill loadout will look something like this: Swift Cast, Lucid Dreaming, Largesse, Protect, and one of Cleric Stance, Asuna, or Rescue. 4 out of the 5 slots are set in stone, no matter what content you're doing. And with the exception of fights that require Asuna, the 5th slot is largely unimpactful. When used optimally, Cleric Stance comes out to an approximate 1 to 2% increase in DPS, which is less than 100 DPS for even the best healers, and while rescue memes are a lot of fun, the skill doesn't really do that much. But this is a contender for the worst case scenario. Healers are typically restricted in their role skill choices because they have a very strict role to play. Heal the party or wipe. There isn't much wiggle room there. Most of their skill choices are to aid them in that role, and anything else comes secondary. So let's pivot to take a look at melee role skills. Typically a melee role skill loadout will look something like this. Diversion and some combination of True North, Feint, Bloodbath, Second Wind, Arm's Length, Invigorate, and Goad. And at first glance, this seems great. Sure, Diversion is much better than the others, but there are still 7 skills vying for the last 4 spots. All in all, this looks good for a system intended to add player choice. This implies that there are 7 good skills to make choices from, and only 3 skills that don't leave much of a choice, since they are either too good or too bad. But on closer inspection, there lies a much more insidious problem. Even though you are able to make choices, these choices are not meaningful. And in fact, by plugging any content into a flowchart, you can find the best assortment of role skills to take. It's very black and white as to what skills are best in each situation. And now you might be thinking, but wait, you were just praising how Feint was a versatile skill in the last section. How is it possible that Feint is both well designed and still can fit into this boring flowchart? And that's a great question. And for that matter, I think True North is a fairly well designed skill for the same reasons as Feint. So it should be questioned here as well. And I think the differentiating issue here is that meaningful decisions can only be made when approximately equally useful skills are competing with each other. And that's a bit of a dense statement, so let's break it down. As a thought experiment, let's imagine that the role skill system was greatly simplified, and players are only able to take one skill. Also, for the sake of simplicity, let's assume that there are only 3 role skills to choose from. And finally, because I'm not that creative, I'm going to use skills that already exist in the game. Say that the role skill pool looks something like this: Feint, True North, and a modified Bloodbath that heals in an AoE. Finally, our last assumption will be that we're fighting God Kefka. So every single one of these skills has its own use. Feint is useful for ultimate embrace, party stacks, or the hard-hitting auto attacks during key segments, like Heartless Angel or the light phases. Bloodbath is useful for segments that require large amounts of party-wide healing, the Forsaken phases, and True North is useful for increasing DPS. Each one of these skills are sufficiently different from each other, and it's hard to gauge exactly when one is better than the other. If you're pushing in Rage, or your party chooses strategies that tend to forsake melee positionals, True North might be better. If your healers need help, Bloodbath becomes much more useful. And if your team decides to prioritize minimizing tank damage, Feint becomes a higher priority. Don't get me wrong, no matter what you do, there will be a meta choice. But for the average player, choosing between these 3 isn't very clear cut, and may be about playing into your team's strengths rather than playing with what's considered to be optimal. But on the other hand, if we add Diversion as an option, it's clear that every player should be taking Diversion in every fight. The benefit of enabling your tanks to lead tank stance and actually use something that isn't an aggro combo is way too high compared to what the other 3 skills offer. Going back to the bigger picture, the issue isn't that Feint is a problematic skill alone. The issue is that nearly every other role skill is very clearly better or worse than Feint, so the decision making process isn't as interesting. Another way to think of it is like this. Given a particular fight or piece of content, we can rank all of a role's role skills on a scale of usefulness from 1 to 10, where 1 means the skill does nothing and 10 means we will wipe without this skill. Then, we will always take the top 5 rated skills. What makes decisions meaningful in this context is when it's difficult to accurately gauge where a skill lands on the scale. In other words, when players can't come to a consensus on how useful a skill is, whether it be due to differing playstyles, preferences, or something else, only then can each player feel like they're making a choice that matters to them. Otherwise, the player is either blindly following the status quo, or rebelling against it to the detriment of their party. A final note here is that ideally, the skills are clustered somewhere around the 7 to 8 range, strong enough that the choice has an impact on your play, but not so strong that you feel gimped for not having access to all the role skills at once. A great example of this is Dismantle and Troubadour. Although these aren't role skills, they highlight the different types of mitigation that Machinist and Bard respectively bring to a fight. In a fight with spaced, strong single hits, such as Mornifa in the Unending Coil of Bahamut, Dismantle is superior, but in segments of sustained damage or when the boss is untargetable, such as Blackfire Trio from the very same fight, Troubadour is likely more effective. And then, ignoring all the other differences between Machinist and Bard, the choice between the two tends to come down to the healers to decide which skill they would prefer. But more importantly, you aren't greatly hurting your party by choosing one or the other. Both bring approximately equal but different utility to the encounter. It's a personal choice. Okay, that was a long look at the biggest issue with the role skill system, and in all likelihood, some of you may not be particularly interested in the exact details behind the mechanics. But here's an issue that both casuals and hardcore players alike can relate to: homogenization of animations. And this doesn't need that much explanation. There is something awesome about playing as a Dark Knight and seeing the shell of pure anger form around you to defend yourself from your enemy's attacks. Or imagining yourself as a scholar and actually using leeches to cure your party of hysteria. This has been completely lost, as those skills have turned into Rampart and Asuna, of which both don't have the same job-specific flair. Finally, one potential upside to the role skill system is that, when implemented properly, it mitigates skill bloat. 10 skills are effectively reduced to 5 slots, since you'll never have to use all of them together. And this is nice in theory, but in reality, it's too difficult to even remember to swap out skills, let alone swap out keybinds for them and remember how they change from fight to fight. What ends up happening is that all 10 role skills get assigned to their own buttons, just like any other skill, and we have 5 extra unusable skills hogging hotkeys. So, given the problems with the role skill system, how do we fix it? Or better yet, how might Square Enix fix it? Because I can write angry comments on Reddit all day, but somehow I have a feeling that might not change anything. Going in reverse order of the problems I listed, how might we address skill bloat, or at least the process of changing skills? While not a direct solution, I would like to see loadouts. Just like how we can create gear sets that have their own glamour, we should be able to save a set of 5 role skills and label it Dungeon, or Shinryu X. It would be even better if we could link the role skill loadouts to certain content and the game updates your role skills accordingly. No more forgetting to swap out Shirk for anticipation. The game can automatically detect that you're entering a dungeon and load your dungeon role skill preset. On the issue of homogenization of animations, this one's very clear and straightforward. Give us back our old animations. Even if it's not called Shadowskin anymore, Rampart should have the Shadowskin animation when used by a Dark Knight. I have to guess that since this is so easy of a solution to think of, it's just not one of the dev team's top priorities. And saving the best for last, how do we address the issue that can be best summarized as a lack of meaningful choices among role skills? This is a bit more complex and isn't something that can be solved so simply on its own. The usefulness of a skill is greatly tied to how raids and dungeons are designed, and the more flexible mechanics are, the more room there is for each role skill to have its niche. And it's beyond my pay grade to make 10 approximately equally useful skills for each role. It might not even be a priority for the dev team either, since it would take so much time to balance. But there are a few structural changes that can start to alleviate the issue. One method is to simply take out the skills that are either too good or too bad. For example, Rampart should be used by the tank all the time, so why even let Rampart be a choice? Lock Rampart into a slot and leave only 4 slots up to player choice. This has the added benefit of signaling to players that Rampart is an important skill, because unlike the other role skills, it's available at all times. Also, this reduces the number of role skills that need to be designed. Taken to its limit, if there were, for example, 3 role skills locked in, this leaves 2 slots up to choice, which proportionally would have a pool of only 4 skills to choose from. That's much more manageable on the balance side. Another method is to further narrow down the role skill choices to be categorized. To explain what I mean, let's again take healer role skills as an example. We can place the skills into 3 buckets as follows: Cleric Stance and Break as offensive skills, Asuna, Largesse, and Eye for an Eye as healing skills, and Protect, Surecast, Rescue, and Lucid Dreaming as utility skills. Then we can say that healers can have 1 offensive slot, 2 healing slots, and 2 utility slots. The categories here aren't exact, and with the current design of role skills, the choice isn't extremely interesting, but the key behind this concept is that each skill only needs to compete with a much smaller pool of skills. Here, Cleric Stance only has to compete with Break. Designers don't need to worry about how Break pairs up against Lucid Dreaming, and it becomes much easier to make sure all skills in a category are about equally powerful. But as I said, neither of these solutions are a cure-all, and nothing can replicate purely having 10 skills that are equally viable. But that's an extremely tough ask, and either having locked role skill slots or categorized slots, or even both together, can make designing and balancing much easier. As for 4.4 changes, in short, I feel like this is a cop-out. Put harshly, we moved from, this is a system that has unrealized potential, to, we can't fix it so we'll just give you everything for now. It's as though the dev team admitted that the root of the role skill system, the choice, is problematic and removed it completely. I would have much rather seen the dev team at least attempt to balance the role skills, rather than unveil the system, leave it in a broken state for over a year, and then effectively remove it from the game. And that's all I have for the analysis. Thanks for all of you who have watched this far. If there's something in particular you liked or didn't like, please leave a comment. This is my first time making video content, or really any sort of content altogether, so I'm looking to gather as much feedback as possible. Also, if there's a topic in particular you would like to see an analysis on, I'm open to any and all suggestions. I have a few topics in mind, but I want to make what people want to see. And with that, until next time.